In the last week of April 1945, as Soviet shells crashed into the gardens above the Reich Chancellery and the smell of smoke drifted down concrete stairwells into Hitler's underground refuge, Germany's most senior military commanders did something they had avoided for 12 catastrophic years. They told their Führer the unvarnished truth. The army that had once stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga had collapsed into a ring barely 10 mi wide around central Berlin. The Luftwaffe existed mainly on paper. The armored divisions Hitler moved across his map table like chess pieces had been destroyed weeks earlier. And the man who had sent millions to their deaths in the name of total victory now faced a choice his generals had been forbidden to make: surrender the capital or attempt escape. For perhaps the first time since 1933, senior officers in field gay uniforms stood before Hitler and spoke words that would have meant dismissal, disgrace, or worse just months before. If you remain in Berlin, you will die here. This is the story of those final surreal conversations in a concrete tomb, 50 ft beneath a burning city, when the architects of the Third Reich's military strategy urged its supreme commander to do what he had always condemned as treason: run. The road to that moment began not in April, but across the brutal months that preceded it. Months that saw the careful destruction of every defensive line between the Oder River and Berlin itself. By mid-April 1945, Army Group Vistula under General Gotthard Heinrici held a thin crust of fortifications along the Seelow Heights, the last natural barrier protecting the capital from the east. Heinrici was a defensive specialist, a methodical officer who had earned respect extracting German forces from impossible positions on the Eastern Front. He knew his mission was hopeless. Facing him across the Oder stood Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front. More than 2 million Soviet soldiers supported by over 6,000 tanks and 40,000 artillery pieces. Heinrici commanded perhaps 100,000 exhausted troops, many of them rear echelon personnel, police battalions, and teenage boys from the Hitler Youth pressed into service with rifles they barely knew how to aim. The Germans had no fuel reserves, no air cover, and no strategic depth. What they did have was the desperate knowledge that behind them lay Berlin, and beyond Berlin, nothing but unconditional surrender. The Soviet assault began before dawn on April 16th. Zhukov employed a tactic that was both brilliant and terrifying. He ordered 143 searchlights aimed at German positions, flooding the darkness with blinding white light to disorient defenders and illuminate targets for his advancing infantry. The effect was apocalyptic. Through the sudden artificial daylight came waves of T-34 tanks and rifle divisions, supported by a rolling barrage from thousands of artillery, tubes that turned the Seelow Heights into a landscape of craters and shattered concrete. Heinrici's troops fought with the ferocity of men who understood that every hour they held meant another hour for families to flee westward toward the Allied lines, away from the Soviet advance and the retribution that would surely follow. They held for 3 days. German anti-tank teams destroyed hundreds of Soviet vehicles in close-range engagements amid the rubble. Teenage boys with Panzerfaust launchers crouched in basement and foxholes, waiting until T-34s rolled within 30 meters before firing the single-shot weapons that were often their only defense. But courage without reserves is a wasting asset. By April 19th, the Seelow Heights had fallen. Zhukov's columns poured through the Breirich, racing westward with orders to encircle Berlin before the Americans could arrive from the opposite direction. Inside the Führerbunker, a 2-level concrete shelter beneath the old Reich Chancellery garden, The atmosphere that third week of April oscillated between manic optimism and suffocating despair. The bunker's upper level housed kitchen facilities, guard rooms, and storage. The lower level contained Hitler's personal quarters, a small conference room, and a narrow corridor lined with sleeping cubicles for essential staff. 18 steps separated the two levels. The whole structure reeked of diesel fumes from the ventilation generator, mildew from poor drainage, and an accumulation of human sweat and fear. Officers arriving from the front descended those 18 steps and entered a realm where the war was still being won on paper, where phantom divisions were ordered to relieve encircled units that no longer existed, where the Führer's hand trembled as it moved colored pins across maps that bore less and less resemblance to reality. On April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, senior figures gathered in the bunker for what many suspected would be the last such occasion. Present were Reich Marshal Hermann Göring Reichsführer, Heinrich Himmler, Propaganda Minister Isef Goebbels, Armaments Minister Albert Speer, and the two men who would soon face the most difficult conversation of their military careers. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, Chief of the Armed Forces Operations Staff, and Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the High Command of the Armed Forces. The birthday gathering was subdued. Göring, already maneuvering to position himself as Hitler's successor, suggested the Führer relocate to the Burghof in Bavaria, where a potential government in exile could be organized. Himmler, secretly pursuing his own negotiations with the Western Allies through intermediaries, echoed the suggestion. Speer, who had recently defied direct orders to implement scorched earth destruction of German infrastructure, said nothing but observed everything. Hitler remained non-committal. He spoke vaguely of relief offensives, of General Walter Wenck's 12th Army striking north from the Harz Mountains to lift the Soviet encirclement, of miracles and final victories that existed nowhere outside his imagination. When Göring departed that evening for Bavaria and Himmler for his headquarters in northern Germany, both men understood they were abandoning ship. What none of them yet grasped was that within days Jodl and Keitel would be forced to tell Hitler something far more dangerous than strategic assessments or casualty figures. They would have to tell him the war was over and his own life was now the only piece left to move on the board. But before that confrontation could occur, the military situation had to deteriorate beyond any possibility of denial. On April 21st, Soviet artillery batteries positioned in the eastern suburbs began shelling the city center. Shells landed near the Brandenburg Gate. The Tiergarten Gardens, once a fashionable park where Berliners strolled on Sunday afternoons, became a killing ground crisscrossed by Soviet fire. That same day, advanced reconnaissance units from Zhukov's army reached Vichy in the northeast and Konev in the southeast, tightening the noose around the city's perimeter. Konev's tanks meanwhile drove west and then north, threatening to link up with Zhukov and seal Berlin inside a steel ring. Inside the bunker, Hitler demanded updates every few hours. Staff officers brought maps showing red arrows converging from multiple directions. The Führer responded by ordering non-existent formations into battle. He directed the 9th Army, already shattered and retreating in disorder, to wheel about and attack Zhukov's flank. He commanded SS General Felix Steiner's depleted corps, a formation that on paper numbered divisions, but in reality comprised a few thousand exhausted men with no tanks and little ammunition to launch a massive counteroffensive from the north. Steiner received the order, read it in disbelief, and made no move to attack. There was nothing to attack with. April 22nd brought the collapse of Hitler's last illusions, and with it the first serious discussions about escape. That afternoon, during the regular military briefing, It became undeniable that Steiner's attack had not materialized, that the 9th Army was encircled and dying, and that Soviet forces would complete the encirclement of Berlin within days, if not hours. Hitler's reaction was volcanic. Witnesses described him shouting that he had been betrayed by cowards, that the SS had failed him, that the generals had lied and the troops had quit. He declared the war lost and announced he would remain in Berlin to personally direct the final defense, then die among the ruins. It was by several accounts the first time many staff members had heard Hitler explicitly acknowledge defeat. The outburst lasted perhaps 20 minutes. When it ended, the bunker fell silent except for the hum of generators and the distant crump of artillery. Jodl and Keitel withdrew to confer privately. They understood that Hitler's decision to stay and die was not just a personal choice. It would trap hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians in the Berlin pocket, forcing them to fight a pointless battle that would end in mass death or Soviet captivity. Something had to be done. What happened next remains somewhat obscured by conflicting post-war testimonies, but the essential outlines are clear. Either later that same day or early on April 23rd, Keitel and Jodl returned to Hitler with a proposal they had never imagined making. The Führer should leave Berlin, not surrender, not capitulate, but relocate to a defensible position where he might continue directing the war, or at least survive to negotiate terms. The most plausible destination was the Bavarian Alps, where German forces still controlled mountain terrain, and where the so-called National Redoubt, a rumored complex of fortifications and supply dumps, supposedly offered a final bastion of resistance. The redoubt was largely a myth, a creation of Goebbels' propaganda machine amplified by Allied intelligence agencies that overestimated German preparations. But in the desperate atmosphere of late April, myths held power. Keitel laid out the argument methodically. Berlin was indefensible. Soviet encirclement was hours away. The 9th Army could not break through to relieve the capital. Wenck's 12th Army was too far south and too weak to affect the outcome. Remaining in the bunker meant certain death or capture. Hitler listened without interruption, his hands trembling from the effects of Parkinson's disease or stress or both, rested on the map table. His eyes, according to one staff officer present, seemed focused somewhere beyond the concrete walls. The proposal was not presented as a retreat, but as a strategic redeployment. Keitel suggested Hitler could fly south to Berchtesgaden immediately, leaving a trusted deputy, perhaps Goebbels, to manage the defense of Berlin. From Bavaria, the Führer could coordinate the southern armies, maintain contact with whatever government structure remained functional, and preserve the symbolic leadership of the Reich. Jodl supported the plan with operational details. Aircraft were still available at Gatow airfield in western Berlin, though fighters controlled much of the airspace. Alternatively, a ground convoy might break out to the southwest before the ring closed completely. Wenck's army, if it shifted focus, could potentially open a corridor. The window was closing rapidly, but it had not yet shut. Hitler could still escape. The room waited for his response. Outside, the bunker's ventilation system cycled stale air through filters designed to protect against gas attacks. Above ground, Soviet rockets slammed into the Reich Chancellery, collapsing walls and igniting fires that cast flickering orange light across the shattered cityscape. Hitler's answer came not in a single statement, but across several hours of brooding consideration, punctuated by monologues that circled obsessively around themes of betrayal, destiny, and historical legacy. He had built the Nazi movement from nothing. He reminded his listeners. He had broken the Treaty of Versailles, reoccupied the Rhineland, annexed Austria, dismembered Czechoslovakia, and launched the greatest military campaigns since Napoleon. If he fled now, he would be remembered not as the conqueror who expanded Germany's borders to unprecedented dimensions, but as the coward who ran when the Reich needed him most. His presence in Berlin, he insisted, gave meaning to the soldiers' deaths. If the Führer abandoned the capital, morale would disintegrate and the defense would collapse into panicked rout. Moreover, Hitler harbored a fantasy that his presence might galvanize a final miraculous reversal, that his will alone could somehow conjure the victory that eluded his shattered armies. This was magical thinking, detached from any military reality, but Hitler had long since crossed the threshold where facts and fantasies blurred into indistinguishability. Keitel tried again. He emphasized the 12th Army's potential, the possibility of linking with remaining forces in the south, the value of preserving the command structure. Jodl, more cautious, focused on operational necessities. If the Führer insisted on staying, at least allow the high command to relocate so that military coordination could continue. Hitler waved off both arguments. He would remain in Berlin. The generals could go if they wished. This was the inflection point, the moment when the German high command faced a choice that would define the final chapter of the European war. Keitel and Jodl could have defied Hitler, could have organized a forced evacuation, or simply departed and left him to his fate. But neither man possessed the will or the ruthlessness to break with the figure they had served for years. Instead, they accepted his decision. Keitel would travel to the 12th Army's headquarters to personally urge Wenck toward Berlin. Jodl would relocate northward to maintain communication and coordinate what remained of military operations outside the capital. Both men understood they were participating in a charade. Wenck's army had no capacity to relieve Berlin, and military coordination meant nothing when there were no units left to coordinate. But the charade allowed them to leave the bunker with their obedience intact. On April 23rd, they departed, descending into staff cars that raced through rubble-strewn streets toward the rapidly shrinking perimeter still under German control. In the bunker, Hitler turned his attention to other matters. Eva Braun's decision to stay with him, the mechanics of his eventual suicide, and the drafting of a political testament that would blame everyone but himself for Germany's destruction. Meanwhile, above ground in the district surrounding the city center, the war that the bunker's occupants discussed in abstract terms unfolded with savage intimacy. Teenage boys from the Hitler Youth and old men from the Volkssturm militia crouched behind makeshift barricades constructed from overturned trams. Rubble and furniture dragged from shattered apartments. Many had received only days of training. Their weapons ranged from obsolete rifles to Panzer-fast anti-tank launchers that required users to stand within suicidal proximity to enemy armor. They wore armbands rather than uniforms, making them irregular combatants who could expect no mercy if captured. Soviet tactics in urban warfare were brutal but effective. Suppress buildings with artillery and tank fire. Advance infantry under covering fire. Clear structures room by room with grenades and submachine guns. Repeat. German defenders inflicted casualties. Soviet losses in the Battle of Berlin would ultimately exceed 300,000 killed and wounded, but they could not alter the outcome. Every block taken by the Red Army was a block lost forever. There were no reserves, no reinforcements, no fallback positions. When ammunition ran out, the fighting ended. When ammunition ran out and Soviet troops closed in, the defenders either surrendered or died. Among those defenders, confusion about Hitler's intentions was widespread. Official propaganda still spoke of imminent relief, of secret weapons about to be deployed, of the Führer's unshakable resolve to defend Berlin to the last. Radio broadcasts exhorted the population to resist, promised that Wenck's army was racing to the rescue, and framed the battle as a heroic stand against Bolshevik barbarism. But rumors circulated constantly. Some said Hitler had already fled to Bavaria or even to South America via submarine. Others insisted he was dead and the broadcasts were lies. A few claimed he was in the bunker but planning a breakout attempt that would take him south to the Alpine redoubt, where the true final battle would be fought. In this atmosphere of fragmentary area information and cascading authority, individual soldiers made their own decisions. Some fought with fanatic determination, believing they were buying time for the Führer's escape or protecting their families from Soviet atrocities. Others deserted, slipping westward in civilian clothes, hoping to surrender to the Americans or British rather than the Red Army. Still others simply waited in cellars and ruins, paralyzed by fear and exhaustion, until Soviet infantry appeared, and the question of resistance or surrender answered itself. Inside the bunker complex, a parallel universe persisted where the hierarchies and routines of Nazi governance continued, as though the world above were not burning. Goebbels, who had moved his family into the bunker despite the protests of his wife Magda, spent hours drafting propaganda communiques that would never be widely distributed. Martin Bormann Hitler's personal secretary and a man whose influence had grown as military figures departed or fell from favor, maneuvered to maintain proximity to the Führer, perhaps hoping for a last-minute shift that might preserve his own position. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, whose relationship with him had been a carefully kept secret, occupied herself with small domestic routines, changing clothes, applying makeup, organizing meals that stood in surreal contrast to the apocalyptic violence unfolding overhead. Staff officers maintained the pretense of military briefings, updating maps with information that was hours out of date, and discussing operations that would never occur. Secretaries typed orders that would never be transmitted. Adjutants conveyed messages between rooms separated by mere meters, preserving the formalities of rank and protocol, even as the structure those protocols served disintegrated into irrelevance. The question of escape resurfaced intermittently over the following days, though never again as a formal proposal from the High Command. On April 25th, Soviet forces from Zhukov's and KV's fronts linked up west of Berlin near Keitel, completing the encirclement. The city was now an island surrounded by a sea of Soviet armor and artillery. Approximately 300,000 German troops and civilians were trapped inside along with Hitler in his bunker. That same day, American and Soviet forces met at Torbau on the Ila River, cutting Germany in half and making any coordinated defense impossible. The Third Reich, which at its zenith had controlled territory from Norway to North Africa, from the Atlantic coast to the Vula, now existed only in fragmented pockets of resistance that diminished hourly. In this context, the idea of Hitler flying to Bavaria became absurd. There were no flight paths that Soviet fighters would not intercept, no airfield secure enough to guarantee takeoff, no ground route that a convoy could traverse without being destroyed. The window had closed. The man who had once held Europe's fate in his hands was now imprisoned in a concrete box beneath a dying city, and the generals who had urged him to leave had themselves departed, leaving him to face the consequences of his refusal. Yet Hitler's decision to remain while sealing his own fate had a perverse strategic logic rooted in his understanding of myth and symbolism. He grasped, perhaps more clearly than his military advisors, that his physical survival in exile would be worthless. Captured or in hiding, he would become a fugitive curiosity. a failed dictator whose grandiose ambitions had crumbled into humiliating flight. But dead in Berlin amid the ruins of his capital, he could shape the narrative of his own end. He could frame it as a martyrdom, a Wagnerian Götterdämmerung, where the hero falls with his kingdom rather than outliving it in disgrace. This was not rational calculation, but the narcissistic reasoning of a man who had always confused his personal destiny with Germany's, who saw his death not as the end of a criminal regime, but as a tragic finale to a historical epic. And so he remained in the bunker, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyalists, dictating his will and testament, arranging his suicide with the meticulous attention to detail he had once applied to military operations, and waiting for the moment when Soviet troops would fight their way to the Reich Chancellery and discover his body. Wenck's 12th Army, the formation that Keitel had gone to galvanize into a relief effort, never came. Wen was a capable officer who understood the military situation far better than the fantasies circulating in the bunker. His orders were to attack northeast toward Berlin, but his actual priority was to hold open an escape corridor to the west, so that remnants of the 9th Army and German civilians could flee toward American lines rather than fall into Soviet hands. On April 28th, elements of Wenck's force reached to within a few miles of Potsdam, the closest they would ever get to the capital before being halted by Soviet counterattacks. Wen sent a radio message to the bunker, explaining that he could advance no further and recommending that any personnel who wished to escape attempt to break out westward toward his positions. The message was clear. There would be no relief, no rescue, no miraculous intervention. Hitler read the message and set it aside. By that point, he had made final arrangements. He married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony conducted in the bunker's map room shortly after midnight on April 29th. He dictated his political testament, a document that blamed Jews, generals, and international conspiracies for Germany's defeat, while accepting no responsibility himself. He appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor, a choice that surprised many since Dönitz commanded what little remained of the Navy, but had no governmental experience, and he prepared for suicide. On the afternoon of April 30th, with Soviet troops fighting their way through the government district less than a quarter-mile from the Reich Chancellery, Hitler and Eva Braun retreated to his personal suite in the lower bunker. Staff members had been informed of his intentions. Goebbels, Bormann, and a few others waited in the corridor. Around 3:30 p.m., a single gunshot echoed through the confined space. Adjutants entered the suite and found Hitler's body slumped on a sofa. A gunshot wound to the right temple, a pistol on the floor. Eva Braun lay beside him dead from cyanide poisoning. The bodies were carried up the emergency exit stairwell into the Chancellor Garden, placed in a shallow crater created by Soviet shelling, doused with gasoline and set alight. The cremation was incomplete. There was not enough fuel and not enough time. Soviet artillery continued to pound the area, and the men conducting the makeshift funeral had to retreat back into the bunker after less than an hour. They left the charred remains in the crater, covered them with dirt, and descended back underground. 2 days later, Soviet troops would discover the site, recover the bodies, and transport them to Moscow for forensic examination. But on that afternoon, in the garden above the bunker, where Hitler had sometimes walked in better days, the man who had unleashed the most destructive war in human history ended his life not in a heroic last stand, but in a squalid, hurried improvisation amid the ruins of the capital he had doomed. The larger irony of those final days was that the general's proposal to escape, dismissed by Hitler as cowardice, might have prolonged the war and increased suffering rather than ended it more quickly. Had Hitler fled to Bavaria, he could have served as a rallying point for fanatical SS units and die-hard Nazis determined to continue resistance in the Alpine regions. The mythology of the national redoubt, though largely baseless, might have inspired guerrilla warfare that could have dragged on for months, costing additional lives on all sides. Allied commanders were genuinely concerned about this possibility in early 1945, devoting resources to planning operations in southern Germany that ultimately proved unnecessary. Hitler's decision to remain in Berlin, therefore, had the unintended consequence of centralizing the regime's collapse. When he died and Dönitz assumed control, the new government had no ideological commitment to suicide resistance. Dönitz's priority was to surrender to the Western Allies rather than the Soviets, and he sued for peace within a week. Germany's unconditional surrender came into effect on May 8, 1945, just 8 days after Hitler's death. Had the Führer escaped, had he established a rump government in the south, had he continued issuing orders to forces that still obeyed him, the war in Europe might have extended into the summer or beyond with catastrophic consequences for military personnel and civilians caught in the extended combat zones. The conversations between Hitler and his generals in those final days also revealed the fundamental dysfunction at the heart of Nazi Germany's command structure. For 12 years, senior military officers had subordinated professional judgment to ideological loyalty, had executed criminal orders, had participated in a system that demanded unquestioning obedience, even when obedience meant disaster. Keitel and Jodl were capable staff officers who understood logistics, operations, and strategy, but they had spent years enabling a dictator whose military decisions were increasingly detached from reality. When they finally told Hitler the truth that Berlin was lost, that the armies were destroyed, that remaining in the capital meant death, they did so not as an assertion of institutional authority, but as a desperate, belated attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. And when Hitler refused their advice, they accepted his refusal and departed, preserving the chain of command even as the command itself became meaningless. This pattern of complicity and abdication characterized the Wehrmacht's relationship with Hitler throughout the war. Officers who might have resisted his worst strategic blunders instead rationalized, adapted, or silently acquiesced. And by April 1945, they had forfeited any moral or practical authority to challenge him. The result was a military catastrophe that consumed millions of lives and left Germany in ruins for the soldiers and civilians trapped in Berlin during those final days. The question of Hitler's presence or absence was largely irrelevant. Whether he stayed or fled, whether he died in the bunker or escaped to Bavaria, the immediate reality of Soviet shells, street combat, and collapsing infrastructure dominated their existence. Food supplies dwindled to near starvation rations. Fresh water became scarce as municipal systems failed. Hospitals filled beyond capacity with wounded soldiers and civilians. Cellars and subway tunnels sheltered thousands of people who emerged only when necessary. Navigating a surface world transformed into a nightmarish landscape of burning buildings, unexploded ordnance, and corpses left unburied because there was no safe way to recover them. The Red Army's approach generated widespread fear of reprisals, fears that were tragically justified as Soviet troops, many of them bent on revenge for the atrocities committed by German forces in Soviet territory, perpetrated mass violence against the civilian population. Women and girls faced systematic sexual assault. Arbitrary executions were common. Property was looted or destroyed. The capture of Berlin was not a clean military operation, but a brutal reckoning that reflected the savagery of the Eastern Front. and the depth of hatreds the war had generated. In the midst of this chaos, the fiction of command authority persisted in fragmentary, airy forms. Local commanders improvised defenses, sometimes with genuine tactical skill. Hitler Youth units fought with reckless bravery born of indoctrination and desperation. SS formations executed suspected deserters and hanged civilians accused of defeatism, enforcing loyalty through terror even as the regime they served dissolved into irrelevance. Radio broadcasts continued to promise relief until the transmitters were destroyed. Leaflets urged continued resistance until there was no means to print or distribute them. The machinery of Nazi governance ground onward through sheer institutional momentum, creating the surreal spectacle of a state that had ceased to exist, except in the minds of those who refused to acknowledge its death. And somewhere in that dying city, among the thousands of men and boys pressed into a hopeless defense, there were surely individuals who wondered what their leaders were doing, whether the Führer, whose portrait had hung in every classroom and public building, was sharing their fate or preparing his escape, and whether their sacrifice served any purpose beyond delaying the inevitable by hours or days. The answer came too late to matter by the time news of Hitler's suicide filtered. Through the remnants of Berlin's garrison, Soviet forces controlled most of the city center. The Reich, that symbol of German parliamentary democracy that the Nazis had rendered meaningless in 1933, fell to Soviet assault on April 30th. After fierce fighting, Red Army soldiers raised the Soviet flag over its ruined dome in a moment that was restaged multiple times for propaganda photographs. Resistance in other districts continued sporadically for another day or two, but without central leadership or hope of relief, most units either surrendered or melted away. On May 2nd, General Helmuth Widling, the officer Hitler had appointed to command Berlin's defense, formally capitulated to Soviet forces. Approximately 130,000 German soldiers entered Soviet captivity. Civilian casualties during the battle were estimated at over 100,000 killed. The city itself was devastated, perhaps a third of its buildings destroyed or severely damaged, its infrastructure shattered, its population traumatized, and facing occupation under the four-power Allied control that would divide Berlin for the next 4 decades. The ultimate irony of Hitler's refusal to escape was that it changed nothing and everything. Militarily, his presence in Berlin had no effect on the outcome. The city would have fallen regardless of whether he stayed or fled. The war would have ended regardless of where he chose to die. But symbolically, his decision to remain shaped how the Nazi regime's collapse would be remembered. It eliminated the possibility of Hitler becoming a fugitive legend, a shadowy figure hiding in South America or some remote redoubt, issuing calls for renewed struggle and inspiring neo-Nazi movements. It concentrated the regime's end in a single undeniable image: the Führer dead by his own hand in a bunker beneath the capital he had led to ruin. That image carried a finality that no capture or escape could have provided. It marked the absolute termination of the Third Reich's political authority and removed any ambiguity about the regime's defeat. For the millions who had suffered under Nazi rule, for the Allied nations that had fought to destroy that rule, and for the German people who now faced occupation and reconstruction, Hitler's death in Berlin represented not a tragic martyrdom, but an inglorious end to a criminal enterprise that had brought catastrophe to the world. The conversations in the bunker during those last days, Keitel's maps spread across the table, Jodl's cautious operational assessments, Hitler's trembling hands and rigid insistence on staying, the staff officers who listened and departed and left him to his fate encapsulated the moral and strategic bankruptcy that defined Nazi Germany's leadership. These were men who had commanded armies, directed operations across continents, and exercised life and death authority over millions. Yet they had spent years subordinating military judgment to ideological fanaticism and personal loyalty to a dictator whose strategic decisions were catastrophic. When they finally offered Hitler a way out, it was not an act of belated wisdom, but a desperate improvisation born of self-preservation. And when he refused, they accepted his refusal, because they had trained themselves never to defy him, even when defiance might have served Germany's interests better than obedience. The result was the complete destruction of the regime they had served, and the descent of Germany into a hell of occupation, division, and national disgrace that would take decades to overcome. For the teenage Volkssturm fighter digging his shallow trench in the rubble as Soviet tanks rumbled closer, for the secretaries in the bunker typing orders that would never be executed, for the mothers hiding in cellars with their children as artillery shells crashed overhead. The question of whether Hitler escaped or stayed was a distraction from the immediate demands of survival, but in the longer view of history, it mattered enormously. It mattered because it determined how the war's end would be understood, how the Nazi regime's collapse would be narrated, and how the moral accounting of Hitler's crimes would proceed. Had he escaped, he would have remained a live problem, a political figure whose existence complicated peace negotiations, whose rhetoric could inspire continued resistance, whose eventual capture or death would require careful management by Allied authorities. By choosing to die in Berlin, Hitler eliminated those complications. He made his own end absolute and unavoidable, and in doing so he inadvertently provided closure to a conflict that might otherwise have festered unresolved for months or years. It was perhaps the only decision in the final year of the war that served anyone's interest beyond his own narcissistic fantasy of historical significance. The staff officer who watched Keitel emerge from that private meeting with Hitler, his face pale and strained, clutching maps marked with routes that would never be traveled, understood in that moment what many Germans would take years to fully grasp. The leadership that had promised greatness had delivered annihilation. The strategies that had claimed to ensure victory had guaranteed defeat. And the ideology that had insisted on total loyalty had demanded total sacrifice for nothing. In the flickering light of the bunker's electric lamps, in the acrid smell of ventilated diesel and human fear in the muffled thunder of Soviet artillery, shaking dust from concrete ceilings, the Third Reich's final act played out not as Wagnerian tragedy, but as pathetic farce. A regime that had terrorized a continent reduced to a handful of desperate men in an underground tomb, shuffling papers, and moving phantom armies across maps while the real armies above destroyed the city they had claimed to defend. 75 years later, the ruins of Berlin have been rebuilt into a thriving capital, but the memory of those final days remains embedded in the city's landscape and consciousness. The site of the Reich Chancellery is now an anonymous stretch of apartment buildings and parking lots. The bunker itself was demolished, filled with rubble and paved over, erased as completely as the regime it sheltered. There are no monuments, no markers, no tourist destinations celebrating Hitler's last stand. Only a simple formational placard acknowledging the location and noting the historical facts without commemoration. This deliberate erasure reflects a broader German understanding that some places should not be preserved, that certain legacies deserve oblivion rather than memorialization. The conversations about escape that occurred in the bunker, the maps marked with desperate routes to Bavaria, the staff officers who shuttled between rooms carrying messages that meant nothing. These have been documented in testimonies and histories, examined by scholars, and integrated into the larger narrative of the war's end. But they have not been enshrined or glorified because there was nothing in those conversations worth glorifying. What remains is the larger lesson about the catastrophic consequences of unchecked power, the dangers of subordinating professional judgment to ideological fanaticism, and the price of complicity with criminal leadership. The generals who urged Hitler to escape were not heroes attempting to save their Führer from an unjust fate. They were accomplices belatedly recognizing that the enterprise they had served was doomed and hoping to extract themselves from the wreckage. Their failure to act earlier, to resist criminal orders, to prioritize Germany's welfare over Hitler's ambitions had contributed directly to the catastrophe they now inhabited. And Hitler's refusal to escape, while consistent with his grandiose self-image, was less a courageous decision to share his people's fate than a narcissistic determination to control the narrative of his own end. Neither the general's proposal nor the Führer's refusal reflected moral clarity or strategic wisdom. Both were products of a system that had long since lost any connection to ethical governance or rational policy. In the end, the story of April 1945 and the day Germany's top generals urged Hitler to escape is not a tale of missed opportunities or tragic inevitability, but of absolute moral and strategic bankruptcy reaching its logical conclusion. The war Hitler had launched to establish German dominance across Europe had instead brought Soviet armies to Berlin's gates. The ideology he had championed as the foundation of a 1,000-year Reich had survived barely 12 years before collapsing into complete defeat. The loyalty he had demanded from his generals had produced not victory but disaster, not glory but mass death. And the decision to remain in Berlin rather than flee, presented to him by officers who had spent years enabling his worst impulses, was not the defiant gesture he imagined, but the final admission that there was nowhere left to run, no position left to defend, no future left to claim. The Reich that had conquered most of Europe died in a concrete bunker beneath its ruined capital, and the man who had built it died by his own hand, leaving behind millions of corpses, a devastated continent, and a legacy of such profound evil that his name would forever symbolize the depths to which human civilization can descend when power is divorced from morality and ambition, from accountability. If this story of desperate endgames and failed escapes resonates with you, if you want to explore more untold moments from history's greatest conflict, when decisions made in bunkers and command posts shape the fate of millions, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into World War II's most compelling human dramas.